Thursday, November 9th. I was thinking the 29th, but that'd be nice. Thanksgiving would be behind us. 3:30 p.m. And let's see, roll call is myself and Oliver as Organizational Focus Committee members. On the matter of the agenda, can I get a motion to adopt the agenda?
So moved.
I presume we're both in favor, so that carries unanimously. Minutes review approvals. Esme is working on minutes. We encourage anyone interested in the topics of the Organizational Focus Committee, including the resiliently integrating sustainable energy work group, to watch our meetings. There's a ton of information there, and we will have some rates posted as soon as possible. Discuss and take action matters pertaining to HDC best practices initiative. So this is the portion of the meeting that doesn't relate to the work group. What did you think of the comments I made at HDC yesterday?
Yeah, I tried to organize them.
Yeah,
and understand. I hope I've got all of them.
I think so. Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah.
I'm going to flesh them out a little bit and do bullet points for estimate for next Thursday. We're not going to do it next Thursday.
Okay.
We're scheduled for the meeting.
Okay.
Because we're going to have a week off.
Okay.
For Thanksgiving.
Okay.
And okay, yeah, I mean, this would be a time if you wanted to add anything to it.
Well, I was thinking of that when I was putting that list together, and I couldn't think of anything, but if I do, I will certainly write it down. We're trying to organize different things, like,
well, yeah, make the HDC, there's
more streamlined.
yeah, well, efficient and effective. And we've been working on some of these for quite a long time, but it really hasn't been right. We brought them up, voted concepts, and they haven't really carried as far as we would like to, but now we're just with the agenda growing and growing. The HCC gets upwards of 70 applications a week. We're many weeks out. That's going to be, we need to make some moves.
Yeah.
To bust a move or 10. So we're working on that stuff. Okay, so nothing to add there. So we're going to go right into the work group related matters, number 2 on our agenda. Update matters regarding resilient integrating sustainable energy rise interest forum and work group membership. So at a past meeting, I mentioned a couple of different things. One, we were going to get HDC members informed of the persons who submitted interest forms and have them, however they decided, whether it was just an informal consent or a formal vote, adopt the work group membership. I think it'd be good to have a vote just to memorialize the membership. Lucy Dillon, welcome.
Thank you.
Lucy had put in an application in our second round in the newspaper for interest forms. I was going to announce that to the HDC under commissioner comments as the chair of the Organizational Focus Committee. 2 meetings we've been just hit with, not that this isn't important, but operational matters that took priority. So that took also the better part of between a half an hour, an hour or more.
Easily an hour.
Yeah, so I didn't get to that point. I will be doing that at our next meeting. Subsequent to that, once you all are part of the work group officially, I was going to already do this, but we didn't do that first step. I was going to send out through Esme a link to the state ethics office and the open meeting law link for town employees, committee members, work group members.
She sent out something.
She sent it today.
Oh, did she send it today?
Yeah, I asked about it and she sent it.
Okay, great. So the encouragement is the conflict of interest law is very serious matter. I encourage you all, if you get involved and as you're involved with town matters, exercise your conscience, think about whether there might be something you have a perceived conflict with. You'll know if there's something you have a conflict with, but if there's something you think you might have someone may perceive as a conflict, and exercise the free service that the state ethics office offers. And many times if there is a potential perceived perception or some other issue, they'll tell you what type of exemption form or disclosure form is required and who to submit it to and so on and so forth. You may already know that, but I'm just telling you because I don't really know what your history is with town things. And Lucy's new here to our group. One of those links will evaluate to the state ethics link, and we specifically request that you contact them either by phone or by email and give them the specifics of your involvement with our work group, what our charter is, which is on the interest form, what the HDC mission is, and if you have any potential conflicts by being involved in another work group, commission, nonprofit, employer. If you have a conflict, they'll address it if it can be addressed. If they can't, they'll save you $10,000 because I believe that's the fine if someone submits that there's a perception that you didn't put in the right form. So it's in everyone's best interest to address that upfront and timely. So that's pretty much it on the membership. We're going to, I think it's fair at this point, just to continue with Andy working here at the table with us in the work group sense, and to welcome Lucy to the same role.
Yeah.
Are you good with that? Okay. So welcome. And Lucy, what we're going to do at this point is we're going to start to take the next item on our agenda is discuss and take action on the RISE work group items. I'll just give you a brief explanation of this. The spreadsheet is a breakdown. Well, there's an introduction. It gives you an idea of anyone who picks this up, an idea of what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it. There is on the tail end, not to be lost in bigger discussion points, what our next steps will be. This is a culmination of group thoughts as we've kind of developed the process, and as are the quote unquote items, which are what are in the spreadsheet. The idea is that the spreadsheet will be updated to reflect input from the work group members, taking comments from the public who are here. And then we will have instead of a preliminary rough draft, we will have a rough draft. And that rough draft will be posted on our webpage under the town. In the meantime, I've asked that people, as a matter of courtesy, because we don't have a full group having sat on and actually reviewed this. This isn't a position. This is like none of these are a position yet. None of them will really be a position until we make a recommendation. But right now, they're just a kind of a organization of thoughts. So as opposed to putting it out there, what I've asked is people just keep it to themselves. It's not like a restricted top secret document or anything like that. It's somebody wants to look at it, they can look at it. But it would be just fair, I think, to the group that we come up with what our actual list of items we want to be pursuing are better organized, and then we can post it on the website. The other intention is that this will actually, once we get to that point, which I hope will be in the next couple of meetings, this will be editable on the screen and set up in an Excel format spreadsheet. We'll have, each week we'll put it up. We can track the revisions, and I think it'll just be a good record document if anyone wants to look at it. It's also going to be useful for creating the recommendations. So the idea is that we've got the information organized as it can be without putting it in a database, where within a database we can create reports ourselves. I just don't have time to do that right now, to build a database and then to do template reports. But this information can easily be brought into a database, and then that will be the next step in creating our recommendations by a volunteer group without it having to be a whole rewrite of a set of notes. So I'm trying to think of the process from A to Z. We've all been trying to think of the process from A to Z. I think we've done pretty well with that. And that's the background. The other part of this, before we jump into where we were, is that I'm kind of leading the discussion as having put it together as the facilitator to keep us on track. We will discuss an item, and the idea is to flesh out some of the, we'll give this a little more depth and breadth that we think may be applicable. So for instance, we talked about camouflage, and then here it's number 3. And it's materials, roof colors, including durable paint, solar skins, etc. The applicability under various circumstances, vegetation. And then we talked about one of the item concepts will be types of trees. So like the HDC has a type 2 fence, type 3. So the idea at this point is to get those types of thoughts on paper, to organize them so that when we do sit down with a final list, we can actually discuss them and then come up with a formulation of recommendations. So at this point, we're trying to document and organize potential solutions or topics related to solutions. And then we'll have it all together and we can sit down and discuss it, each of them as we go. The reason we're doing it this way also is because some of these are going to be topics or items that we want to revisit at a later date. They relate to a different topic, but we want to have them organized. So instead of just going through and saying, oh, let's talk about this today and then make notes, we're trying to organize them so that there's also a referential aspect. As you can see, there's many pages to being able to handle this kind of a monster of a project, again, as volunteers. So we talked about the example of putting some flesh on this, again, with the camouflage was, we would, as a work group, before we got into, in order to formulate recommendations, one of the areas of potential recommendations was, do we want to offer up 3 different types of trees, whether they're deciduous and evergreen or based on size, with respect to camouflage, with respect to the exposure to the roadway, whether a ground array is camouflage by fence, sunken, or vegetation, so that those would each of those could then have, if we decided to pursue a recommendation, each of those would be fleshed out and put into the recommendation itself. I'll give you one other example if you don't mind. I'm trying to think of just a simple one. Oh, so number 2B, elimination of sawtooth effect, visible location. So basically when we're saying sawtooth, it's similar to like these patterns on the wall. Yeah, or like the dormer, the gable dormer, and you can't get it close enough, and it draws your eye, right? That's so we're cognizant of that effect. And we've identified one of the items we want to address in the recommendations, the elimination of sawtooth. As an example of some of the things we want to talk about and look into are sacrificial panels. So a panel that could be cut and installed to eliminate that effect. What's involved with that? Is it practical? Is it too costly? Do you have to deaden the electronic circuitry somehow by shorting it out, because otherwise it's going to be conducting electricity?
Wait, I gotta back up.
Yeah.
You cut a panel and.
So basically, if this were, you can't actually get a panel to fit here.
Yeah.
So to eliminate the sawtooth effect on a roof,
Okay.
you would, we were referring to it as a sacrificial panel. So you would take one panel and you cut it in half and cut it in half.
You're putting it down.
Yeah, it wouldn't affect, the only thing it affects is the visual, because you're eliminating the sawtooth.
Yeah.
So that was, again, just an example of, we want to look into sacrificial panels and see if that's a viable route for a recommendation. We also want to look into, we identified that these are primarily caused by dormers. For new homes, is there an approach we can take with architects and designers to be sensitive to the fact that the southern exposure of a roof is the primary fertile ground for these
Yeah,
panels?
designing has to put it in the.
Yeah.
Located correctly.
Yeah, and so maybe the dormer doesn't get put smack in the middle, a gable dormer doesn't get smack in the middle of the house that faces the south.
I'll turn the house.
Whatever it is. So the idea is that we'll talk to, one of our recommendations will be potentially is pursuing discussions with architects and designers for about new homes on how that might be addressed through their design practice. Existing, you know, we talked about,
Pipe penetrations.
yeah, the pipe penetration. So basically you've got your stack vent for your plumbing that might come up in 1/3, off 1/3 of the roof arbitrarily in a house. It's the shortest run, that's where the plumber puts it. I got no issue with that. But it doesn't have to be there. It can, and during new construction, go up the rafter bay across in where the collar tie, above the collar tie height, and go out the other side of the
That
roof.
would have to be in a certain place.
Exactly.
Right.
But he's good enough to move it.
Right.
Right.
So those are potential recommendations, and we wanted to document them, and that's what we're going to continue to do until we get to the end of the list. I'll be updating the list, and then we'll do a final review of it, and then we're going to actually get into the meat and potatoes of discussing the solutions. The
I
recommendations.
do have one question,
Yeah, go ahead.
and having been on HSAP for a number of years, is that, you know, you're doing architectural review, whatever, and solar technology, and I have had solar myself, not on island, but all fire on the pool and the house. The technology changes very quickly.
Right.
Correct. That on HSAP, we don't know what the solar panels look like. And it would be nice, it's like roofing sample material. It'd be nice to, like, up on this building, if there were samples of solar installations, how it looks. How high it sits, how proud it sits off the roof line. I mean, fine, if that panel's this thick, but somebody mounts it 10 inches off the roof, that's not good.
Well, I think we have some.
Okay, so what I'm going to do just to facilitate on that is, I'm making a note.
Yeah.
Lucy's idea of sample panels that will become in this, that will go on here as number 18 for now. These are not in any particular order other than somewhat organized for the sake of discussion. And then when we get to that, we'll talk about what other elements we would want to address when we address that item
Okay.
in discussion.
Great.
And happy to take them as we go. But that'll be sample panels.
Kind of like what we did with the roof colors.
Yeah,
Sample panel,
so HDC members can drive in the parking lot. They're-
central location. Okay,
And the town gets some juice off the roof.
Well, if they're hooked up,
we can practice our sacrificial panel. We gotta bring my own meter over here.
but it, I mean, it's not visible.
Yeah. No, that's a good idea. So, four, I'm gonna ask, four is layout and location. We're gonna jump right into this now. I think, do you have any questions on what we're trying to accomplish at this stage?
Well, no, I must say that I live downtown on Liberty Street, and my main concern is that, and I'm all for, you know, I'm an environmentalist, obviously, land council, but my concern is to preserve the historic look. But it's done properly to include new technologies. It's certainly possible, but there's a place for everything.
Okay, fair enough. And my only request is that you take your perspective and then you review it and, you know, self-reflection against what the interest form charter is for the group. So that we're bringing our own experiences and our own subjectivity, but to the same goal.
Okay.
Because then we're not gonna be like, you know, no big ground rules or anything on this. It's just, that's, you know, our role is to bring our own experiences, our own knowledge to the problem solving table, and the problem solving is framed by the interest form introduction. And I would just ask that everyone do that, and a little bit of honest reflection goes a long way, and I think that's enough said for everyone. Whether you're adamantly for solar, whether you're adamantly against solar, whether you're in the middle as you are, whether it's, you know, primarily about preservation of the historic structure, all of those things are important, and we want to encourage discussion, because if we get enough people with enough varied ideas, then we're probably going to come up with some great solutions.
Oh, yeah.
So you know, this is like the collaborative side of what we're hoping to accomplish. Layout and location, I'm gonna introduce this topic and then I'm gonna ask you guys to, to do some homework. And then we'll pick this one up at the very next meeting and discussion. The existing, sustainability guidelines include solar installations, some of which the HDC certainly, certainly and currently follow, and some of which we've made, revisions to. So for instance, one of the guidelines is that the panels be in the upper third of the roof, and the HDC, contemporary HDC has modified that as a matter of policy, that the panels would basically cover the roof. So that your eye isn't drawn to, unlike the sawtooth effect, but for the same purpose, the same rationale, this dark stripe on roof. The whole roof is a dark color, and in conjunction with that, the roof shingles are black. So when you go through, what I want you to do is please look through those with respect to the solar, become familiar with them, because they will be the item we talk about next week with respect to what elements, in addition to what are in the, sorry, I want to turn the volume off on this, apologize. What elements, in addition to what are in there, do we want to include for later discussion? And what of those that are in there do we want to talk about because we think they may need modification? And certainly the example I gave is one that will need modification. Putting them in the top third is not.
I thought that was sunroof,
Solar,
No.
heat, skylights.
skylights. I
No,
thought that was the rule for skylights.
no, I'm pretty sure it's the other one too.
So we're supposed to go through the HDC solar reg.
Yeah, and we can ask, if you don't have a copy, they are available online, and I think we'll have them. I'll ask Esme to please forward them to you all. But the other thing, just before we go on, Lucy, I want to let you know, one of the groups, I believe it was Andy, thank you so much, came up with the concept that we'll have a repository of all the documents that we use or create. That's accessible on the town's, through the town's website. So at one point, once we get the draft, this will be there. The article that at town meeting, the comments that were made, the information on the vote, the sustainable guidelines, any operational emails of significance, anything that we need to be able to work on will be accessible online for the members. So that we are aware, we're just going to get the doc, we're going to wait till we get this done, and then we'll put that together. I don't think there's anything we need at this point to be able to access. Okay, I digress, I apologize. But that's the homework. Does that make sense to you all? So you just basically want to go through it and understand what the current written guidelines are. Val and I can, at the discussion next week, talk about what's changed. And then we can list out items we would like to see addressed. The next topic is cardinal point orientation. So the azimuth angle and the elevation, which is the tilt. We discussed this as an important aspect of recommendations. We wanted to get an idea of what the optimal are, the optimal orientation, the angle and tilt are, cardinal point angle for spring, summer, spring, fall, winter. We wanted to get an idea of what technologies are available to maximize the return. So for example, tracking the azimuth, the angle relative to the cardinal points, and tracking the adjusting the tilt. So you're tracking the inclination of the sun.
Can you do that?
Yeah, yeah.
Like electronically?
Oh yeah, automatically. Now,
Would
not
you even want to do it with the high winds we have here?
well. So the idea was that so this is a great example of what we're going to talk about when we get into these. So
That's when I get confused when we're supposed to. Yeah.
Well, the idea is that right now we're just not trying to go down the path of discussion on a particular topic. We're just trying to identify the related topics that we want to talk about.
Tim has a point.
Yeah, Tim, go ahead.
There's about 6 trackers on them. We installed all of them. Just for point of reference, there's 600 on Marcus Radio.
Those are the things that go like
Yeah,
that.
it's called a dual access tracker. And to solve your wind problem, they have a wind detection device on them. And as soon as the wind picks up above, I think it's like 25 or 30, they flatten out.
So this is a great example of what we're trying to do. So now Tim's identified an element which we'll call the dual action tracker. I presume there's a single action, dual access.
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 Thanks, Tim.
Dual access. I presume
David
there's,
Preston has one, right?
I presume there's a single axis tracker.
I remember when that one came in.
When this is all put together, there should be photographs of this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and we
That's
already laid out
all.
a sheet for it, like we did concept of what that'll look like. So single axis tracker, dual axis tracker, Val was talking about something else, which is the kind of that solar flower.
Oh,
Right.
that's different.
Well, yeah, so basically what Tim identified is you can have a solar installation. And this device on a single axis tracker, which would be tilt, could go like this.
On a roof?
No, we're not talking about on a roof.
On the ground.
We're just talking about the technology. What we're gonna identify in a second is whether this relates to the roof or just the ground. The dual axis, I'm just trying to explain.
I
this.
know, it's just unnecessarily complicated, like it is every week, and I just can't. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I take exception to unnecessarily complicated. Are you the one who's gonna write up these recommendations at the end? Are you the one who's gonna go through
It
this?
didn't say anywhere there freestanding. It said tracking azimuth, angle and all that. How was I to not know it wasn't on the roof?
Right, but how is your, I mean, we need to work through this as a group and if we have some robust discussion. I accept that. Oh, please. I want to add to the complication. Yes, so then please voice that you would like to talk about at this point, roof versus ground. That's a good one. Roof, question mark, grounds, question mark. That's the purpose of this exercise. Lucy, please go ahead.
I was just gonna say, if it's not indicated, it's roof or ground, just assume it's both.
Yeah. The solar, so back to the point, so you understand the technology, the dual axis can tilt up for the inclination of the sun. So if the sun is low on the horizon, it can capture more rays. And as the sun rises, it tilts back and to whatever plane it is at its base, whether it's on the roof, on a non-visible side, I presume, or if it's on the ground. That's the single axis, or maybe the single axis could also be the angle relative to the sun tracking across the sky. So it could go like this as the sun goes from east to west. And then if you've got a dual axis, if the sun is low, and then as the sun comes up and it tracks across the sky, it would do this. So it goes from east to west, and it goes from lower inclination as the sun rises to the sun being higher in the sky. So those seem like great topics to discuss for a recommendation. You know, I mean, that part doesn't have to be complicated. Yeah, subject to cost, they're really, really important.
Because if it's that on a roof, that has concerns for me. That's why.
I know, but Val, you're getting way ahead of yourself on this. It's not, please, no one invest themselves in that we're talking about these, so they're gonna happen. This is to get the ideas on the table, to document them, to organize them, so we can have discussion about the pros and the cons when we get into the discussion phase of these topics. If we try to discuss each one of these as we go, we are never gonna get anywhere, and we're never gonna have it be well organized.
Okay, so we're just reviewing the technology.
Well, we're reviewing concepts that relate to a particular idea, trying to document them. Right now, I'm using the example that Tim provided as fleshing this out. So number 5, we just came up with 2 technologies, 3 with Val's, which is the solar flower that it's more of an art piece, but also functional, and then it rotates on a dual
That was
axis.
what we had a couple of years ago.
Yes,
And what do you call that? What's the actual term for that?
it was called a flower.
Flower.
Sunflower?
Yeah, it's.
It seems very expensive.
It's not what.
Don't get it. But let's leave it on the list.
Yeah, we'll leave it on, and
Somebody might want,
right, and
or four.
Well,
what,
that's a classic example, you know, some new technology that.
Well, its design center really is is portability, which is
Yeah.
not what we're solving for here.
okay, so we're gonna discuss that when we get to it, and then we're gonna cross it off the list, probably.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
A question for Tim. Are all the of the 6 trackers that you've installed, are they all on the ground? Are they ground arrays?
They're ground mounted
Can you use the same technology on a roof?
conceptually, but
Okay.
it would. Conceptually. yes.
Okay. Cool.
Okay, so and then that's where we're really thrilled to have expert advice, somebody who does installations. They, you know, Tim will come in and he'll say, my name is Tim Crothers, I work for X Smart, and I'm a solar designer installer. So he gets that identified up front, and then he'll be able to sit here and be able to contribute to the process. So when we get there, and I apologize, it's gonna take a little while to get there, but I'm very organized and we're gonna get it together, because at the end, somebody has to put together these recommendations. It's probably gonna be me for you all to review them, and I need it to be organized so that I can actually provide that product in my lifetime.
Okay.
So that's cardinal point orientations. Is there any other thoughts on the cardinal point orientation at this point? I mean, it's basic. It's going to be a tilt or an angle. It's going to be on the roof of the ground. So, you know, cost will be something we discuss peripherally when we get into the discussion. So I'll put cost as a question mark.
Question for Tim, can you use the same tilt tracker with a bifacial panel?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll put bifacial panel. So bifacial is, Lucy, you might guess, we talked about this last time, is it gains solar from both sides of the panel. One side less.
I never knew there was such a thing.
Yeah, so that, and so we'll get into that discussion too. Okay, so good, we got through one of them. Woo-hoo! Number 6 is minimum kilowatt required for a typical Nantucket build out. Basically what we're looking for here is the HDC is approached with information, and we need to be able to determine in the context of mitigation of adverse visual effects, if that's applicable. So what I mean by that is it's visible from the primary street, the roadway, the primary view of the structure. We're provided information that we can't ascertain the validity of, and in part, we want to understand what is the typical kilowatt hour required for a typical Nantucket build out, so that we can make a determination as a matter of policy where the HDC feels it's appropriate. If someone is coming in, for instance, I'll use an extreme. I know Tim says this doesn't happen, take it at face value. Someone puts maximum solar on their structure, and by maximum, or they come in and they apply for maximum. And what I mean by that is they're not maximum relative to their own electrical use, but maximum with regard to the roof space they have. The HDC has no way to understand how much do they really need for their home, because anything above and beyond that is a surcharge on the aesthetic. And it's a surcharge in the sense that everyone else gets to look at it. And there's an adverse effect because it's a visual, it's not a historic, there's no historic context for it. So we want to get an idea of what actually would be for the sake of discussion at this very moment, without getting into broader discussion, the appropriate amount based on fulfilling the needs of that structure. Now, we can also then have another discussion. We're not going to get into a ton of discussion, but it will feed into our recommendation to the HDC for their policy recommendation. And that is, well, what about if someone has more roof space? What about if somebody has a non-visible location and they can put it back to the grid? Is that an issue that affects the HDC? We're not going to debate that and discuss it now, but I'm not, at this point, I'm using examples. I'm not trying to plant anchors about what we're going to recommend and not recommend. I'm trying to provide you an example that we're going to talk about both sides of the issue as relates to the HDC's mission, and then we'll formulate the recommendation. I'm also trying to give you an understanding of why this is even on the list, because we've talked about this already a couple of times. So, with respect to typical, this would be determined and defined to reflect the square footage, at least the square footage of cubic volume, percentage of fenestration, because fenestration affects the and the hot and cold, the load on the property, electrical load. It all boils down to kilowatts, calories to kilowatts, BTUs to kilowatts, whatever it is. The bedroom count, that factors in what the local energy cost is, size categories. So that would be some of the characteristics that we would want to define as part of typical in order to come up with mathematical, and Tim has the information, a representation of what the typical kilowatt hour is, and then that translates to the number of panels eventually. We would also want to break this down into size categories. So like determining the typical is going to relate to, is it a, and please don't, when I say primary, secondary, tertiary, I'm not talking about zoning, primary, secondary, tertiary, I'm talking about the size of the structure. But we have under our zoning bylaw, primary, secondary, tertiary dwellings. And some of the primary is typically larger, the secondary is typically smaller by 20%, and the tertiary is typically no more than a certain amount of ground gross floor area. We would want to have a typical kilowatt hour for each of those types of sizes. And it would be in a gross sense. It's just a guide for discussion. It's not to pin this down for a specific home, how and where solar is installed. Again, it's more information for the HDC to make policy decisions. There's going to be people on HDC who just want to say, well, this is way too complicated and this is not intended to do, Val, and I just want it to be easy and just tell me how much it can be. There's no easy button with this stuff, you know, and the other thing that people often confuse is simple. Simple, to get to simple is often not easy. There's a lot of work that goes beyond into getting to making something simple. So we're going to do some legwork, hopefully, like just a minute, Tim, put together an idea of what the kilowatt hours are. If we want to simplify it for recommendation, I'm all on board with that. This may sound complicated. It may sound very difficult. These are very simple, easy calculations to come up with. For instance, if Andy, who's a HERS rater, puts these into a program and he can audit simply by reference in his own experience. This is a primary dwelling, this is a primary dwelling, 3 primary dwellings, 10 primary dwellings, and he can average kilowatt hours. He's already got this information. Tim has got this information. So they'll know the number of bedrooms and things like that. We can make this very simple. We're talking about it in detail for the purpose of transparency. Then, one second, Tim, I just want to get through this. What the cost is for the project, for the different categories for a typical Nantucket home, and what the return is to the grid. And that might include based on 3 different dominant panel suppliers products, but maybe not. If Tim says, look, these products are all within 5%, it's a waste of time, and that's, we would take that at face value. We could simplify the process there. So Tim, I'll take your comment and then we'll kind of jump into factors that might relate to this.
So you're correct in that the numbers are conceptually available.
Yeah.
The question I have is it relevant?
Sure, and it is, and I'm gonna address it, but then we're not gonna keep getting into it because we've talked about this several times in group. The HDC as a policy body makes decisions on architectural elements, new and existing structures, and proposed changes. Part of that in historic context is well known, well established by the Secretary of the Interior with mitigation. And what does mitigation involve? Well, first of all, adverse effects. Are there adverse effects? And so what are the mitigations? One of the mitigations is actually a dollar offset in many instances. That is relevant to what the HDC is discussing, as are mitigation by visual screening, camouflage. The HDC needs to have an understanding when it sits down to have a policy discussion. I'd like to think of an example. If we're told, if somebody needs to put all of a sudden, all the fire fighting apparatus in the world stopped working for some mysterious reason. And we're told that we need, every Nantucket home needs a water tank on top of the house. We would want to know as the HDC, how big does that water tank need to be for each house? And that's relevant information in determining the architectural review. It's kind of a crazy example, but it well suits the mission and the concept. So that's what this information is going to help us determine, is how many solar panels, how big of a water tank is required on that roof. And from there, we can determine how we want to approach it. That will not be individually, that will be in concert with, does it face the street front? Is it invisible? And visible not just because there's a tree somewhere, but it's on the back of the house, it's within a subdivision, say Pine Valley, and it's located in such a situation that it's not near an abutting land bank property or another town road or something like that. So those types of elements will also come into the discussion, but we still need to know how much water needs to be in the water tank for the discussion of the particular home.
Yeah, but the HDC doesn't need to know how much the tank costs.
Well, we don't, but we will also be able to then, with respect to the costs, be able to address whether in some instances it makes sense because there's an offset to the community. The mitigation is in fact the return to the grid and helping to prevent a third cable, is what we're told. Those are discussions the HCC is going to have at a later date, if it will. We're just trying to put together the information. The cost part of it is something that might be considered. It's something that might not be considered. But again, it's simple information to print out. When you're printing out a report on this stuff, it's all right there. It's not like someone has to go and figure this all out. It's done in the program, the HERS program. It's done in the solar costing programs. It's part of the marketing for the solar sales. So it's just information we have available to us. So one of the items, Tim, sorry, one of the items that we identified in this was who's the source of the information. That discussion, we just identified source. So it may be HERS Rater, it may be the solar company, it would probably be both. One of them, Lucy identified is, and Tim identified is, what's the relevancy? And hopefully we won't have another discussion about the relevancy with respect to the water tank size, but cost. So fair game. I'm not trying to shut down discussion.
I just can't.
Yeah.
Having been in front of the HDC myself, representing myself for 3 different properties, that the cost of anything is never even,
Yeah.
It's more like you have to do this or you should do this.
Well, so what this does, knowing the cost helps us develop in a recommendation, a framework, if we think it's appropriate, for the HDC to consider cost, not cost to the person installing the solar, but as the rebate to the community as a matter of policy. Do they want to consider that as a mitigation, which is a standard form of mitigation, having worked in the Section 106 on the federal government projects for the HDC. So, monetary compensation is an offset on adverse effects. We'll discuss that later under relevancy, cost, and the idea is as a matter of policy, mitigation from the HDC perspective. That's not to suggest, I just want to be clear, that the HDC will sit at the table and say, well, your house needs this many kilowatts and it's going to be this many dollars and we're not going to accept it. I'm not talking about a discussion like that. I'm talking about a very broad discussion of, will we, the HDC, consider the offset in energy costs as a mitigation in some instances? And if so, which? I don't think it's going to be on the front of the house.
Here's an example where it may be relevant. In my mind, a house only needs 5 kilowatts to be net zero, but to make that 5 watts, we only need 12 panels. but it exposes the roof in a sawtooth fashion or doesn't cover the roof entirely. When in fact that roof face can accommodate 10 kilowatts.
Well, then put in a pool that you can heat.
Perfect. Or offer it up to your neighbors as mitigation. I don't know.
So the other thing we talked about was the idea of looking into and determining these kind of solutions where solar is shared. And maybe one of the ones, private solar gardens and or cluster installations, public solar gardens and or cluster installations. So one of the elements of that will be, what would you, can you give me a bumper sticker term for what you just said? For sharing, you know, neighbor sharing.
Shared energy.
Well, the term we use is, it's called virtual net metering.
Yes.
So virtual net
I would
metering,
not come up with
virtual net meeting,
Metering.
metering, sorry, between neighboring homes as a mitigation.
that practice today, Tim.
Yes.
Awesome.
Great.
So we've identified another topic under a different item. And that's again, what I'm trying to accomplish here is to get through this virtual net meeting.
I think the question the HDC would be asking is, why is it so big? And why is it so seemingly small?
Yeah.
And if the owner says, I have a heat pump and I have 2 electric cars, that's a legitimate reason why it's so big. And Andy gave a reasons for why it might be seemingly smaller than what the roof could bear.
So we're getting into discussion that I think we need to hold off on.
Yeah.
Because, you know, but to address it, the HDC, that's the type of cost the HDC doesn't address is, well, I have a pool pump, I have indoor jacuzzi, I have a sauna, I data mine cryptocurrency. Like that's nothing we are concerned about. The only cost element the HCC is concerned about is there something that can be utilized as a mitigation? And the cost, I'm probably not using that term the way I want to use it, is more of a revenue. So is there a revenue that can be utilized, a surplus of energy, an energy revenue that can go back to the system that can help the community? That's the type of cost the HCC would consider. Just for discussion purposes, when we get to that, we're not going to be talking about the cost to an individual, and I'll change cost in there.
And so maybe we have to keep the consumption of the building.
We're going to talk about this more because I think there's definitely.
Oh, we're, yeah,
in this area.
there's, but again, we are going to talk about these things until we're blue in the face. But right now, we're just trying to identify some of them to fill it out so that we can have, think about these things in advance before we sit down to discuss them. So, is cost even the right term? Again, these are, put together.
And if HDC is requesting that the entire roof be covered, then that building's overproducing. So, and that person had to spend 40% more on the installation.
Right, so we want to.
So where's the mitigation in that?
Yeah, we want to look at both sides
in
in
that partnership
transaction. Yeah, this, the overarching concept here is that subject to the HC's mission, this is a shared responsibility. And it's a shared responsibility with people who want to install solar, especially if they think they're going to install it in the front of their home and in any area that's going to be visible, because there isn't a historic context. The island is a national, as you know, this is for the folks at home or watching popcorn. This is a national historic landmark. So we're trying to develop all these solutions and recommendations along the line of shared responsibility. Please.
I interrupted. Were you going to say something? No, okay. I was just going to move on to 6B.
Yeah, please.
Sorry. 6B, PV and thermal. The thermal equation can also be addressed by HERS readings or by a licensed installer of solar thermal.
What is that?
The evacuated tubes or other technologies. Has anyone done the sundown yet, Tim? There's a diaphragm that sits underneath the PV array that captures the radiant heat off the backside of a panel and heats hot water in a loop to your
Is
hot
that the
water.
ones that stick way up
Yeah.
high, like the one in Mattocket?
Some are.
Yeah.
The evacuated tubes are, they're round tubes like
Yeah.
this, and they're in a series, or there's a diaphragm that sits underneath your solar array. It would be like that, and that diaphragm on the bottom, this edge, actually has liquid flowing through it, glycol based, that transfers heat back to your hot water tank. So you can heat your house with that.
So our sources for information on that would be Earth Radar, or licensed installer, Hydro Solar, we'll refer to it. Again, relevancy, cost, is cost even the right term as a policy mitigation from HDC policy perspective will be a topic of discussion. And another will be mitigation or burden as matter of shared responsibility. Okay. Anything else on that one? I think they're very similar because they're all going to be similar installations. From the aesthetic point of view, they're similar because it's a similar look. So there's no ground there to get into on this particular topic of the minimum kilowatt hour required for typical Nantucket build out. It'll basically be the source, the relevancy of cost is policy mitigation matter, and burden is matter of shared responsibility. So that would be duplicated here. And we'll take those discussions, I think, as we would a pool and a cabana, and let them happen at the same time to some extent, so that we can, get through it one more quicker. When we get to the point of discussion, to establish minimum requirement applicants based on what is minimum required for the proposal to, so this is basically what 60 is what I was explaining this. To establish minimum requirement applicants based on what is minimally required for their proposal to have objective third-party parameters which the HDC deliberate upon and determine the feasibility of architecturally based alternative solutions. And rationally determine if and so to what extent mitigation or other actions are required of an applicant to decrease or eliminate adverse effects. So we know a typical home requires this much, and this home based on that formula requires 10 panels, and they've asked for 50. We can make policy decisions, or we can rely on policy decisions we've already made about somebody who's over solaring their home, in a sense. Or if the HDC requires that someone put the other 40 panels on the house because 10 looks silly, then we can factor that into our decision making as a matter of policy, not necessarily, when I say matter of policy, I'm talking about one of the things the organizational focus committee did. Lucy, we talked about this before, maybe where is we reviewed fencing. We reviewed what it looked like, where it was located, and then we made some recommendations to the HDC. And based on those policy decisions, the HDC now makes decisions much more quickly that are consistent and fair to everyone. And that's what we'd be looking to do with this. So I think 6 is done.
Yes.
Okay. So sizing and returns in relation to minimal kilowatt required for typical net homes for the real world project. We will determine the actual coverage. So this is another one that's going to appear to be really complicated, and it's not. So this is identifying the parameters and for both roof and ground array, and it boils down to A is what are the parameters, B is determining the efficacy based upon real world information. So Tim has a ton of installs. There's other solar installers who have information that could give us data to determine whether these are actually as effective as they're meant to be Because as a matter of policy, let's use an example. If they're only 10% is effective in the energy output as they're purported to be, which I know they're not, then the HDC may say, well, as a matter of policy, we absolutely we don't see a mitigating factor for adverse effects that can overcome the fact that these things are a waste of time and visual space. So that's an extreme example on one side, but that's the basis to have this information. Roof and ground array also talks about the efficacy. So that's efficacy trade-offs and environmental effects. So trade-offs may be with respect to the aesthetics, having it on the ground versus the roof, and environmental effects may be that both short-term and long-term. So for instance, ground temperatures, a large enough solar array can affect ground temperatures.
Well, how about you're just cutting down native vegetation?
Vegetation,
Habitat.
that's a good idea. That's a good one. Habitat. The other one could be, and that's in a later one is under reclamation. C2 reclamation is like the landfill. Okay. So that covers a lot of ground that we can unpack when we get into the discussion on that one. Based on the objective to establish minimum requirements. So C is basically what is required on an application for a third party to provide the HDC, so the HDC can just review it. Well, number one, the HDC gets educated on the topic, the matters, the vocabulary, and can review this information much as we do now. We aren't, this is probably not a good example, but design flood elevation. So one of the things we're working at the HDC is, and this is kind of one of our babies from OFC is the vocab starting to get individuals in the HDC accustomed to and understanding the vocabulary related to FEMA, the flood insurance or the flood certificates, the design flood elevation, the base flood elevation. It's all very confusing until you understand it, and then you understand it and you can work with the vocabulary. The part that's relevant to this is not only the concept of developing and putting the vocabulary into the culture, so we're discussing it, it's also what information do we need to see on an application to then use it. So with respect to the FEMA stuff, we need to see the design flood elevation, and we need to know what flood zone they're in. If you're educated on the vocabulary, then you can then use that to put together an assessment. That's what this number C is about, is what is required minimally for in an application form for the HDC to be able to review it once the HDC understands what it's reviewing. And then we can say, oh, wait a minute, you want it, again, using the example, you want it to be 10 feet, you're in AL9 and your design flood elevation, or you're in the AL, you're in the A zone and your design flood elevation is 7 feet. You only need to go up 7 feet. So what's the good reason for the extra 3 feet? Can you show us a reason that works? How does that fit into the policies on mitigation? How does it, and that's where the cost comes in. Is there some type of a benefit to the community? It's just an interrelated puzzle. Are there questions kind of on what C is about? I mean, the wording is, I don't know, I must have had some extra job when I wrote that, but basically we're looking at what's the application information provided by a third party. And what do you think we're going to need on that? Obviously we're going to have someone write it up. We're going to need a HERS rater and an installer to help us determine what are relevant. What criteria are relevant. And then in the recommendation phase, we would have to come up with in recommendation phase, come up with a format. Is it a checklist? Is it a certification? For now, I mean, just on the FEMA, I'm not suggesting this level, but just to put out there what I mean by the certification is we have an engineer submit the, under their license, under the authority of their license, what the design flood elevation is.
What are the needs of the building, production wise? Which electricity does the building need? And what's the proposed array designed to produce?
Yeah, and that's covered under A.
I changed the language of 7C to what's on your application. On my page.
Yeah, I think that this is more
Info for application.
what that morphed. It was originally something else, and then in discussion now, I think I went to what's on your application. Because I don't quite recall, and I did this on August 2nd. I wrote this up. Okay, so what's on their application? Okay.
And Lucy and Tim have both pointed this out, and I pointed this out in the past also, but I want to put it to bed here, but I still want to suggest that these factors end up, they're not architectural.
That's right.
So nothing architectural about 6 or 7.
Mm-hmm.
Just to acknowledge that, and in the application process, you might have an addendum or an added section that addresses all these points. So I think it's important for our group to separate or acknowledge what's architecturally driven and HDC oriented in that sense. But certainly agree, adhere, and want to expand on what the mitigation, minimum kilowatt use, sizing, and such. What all that means, I think, is vital to public information and useful to the HDC. Made a number of excellent points where it's very valuable to understand that. And I think that can certainly inform future policy, which I think there's a ton of value. But I don't want to we have a lot to do, and it's challenging for us to focus on all of this at once. So I'm wondering if maybe in our discussion, we can kind of reprioritize them so that the architectural components can get addressed first, and then we can get into the more nuts and bolts of what the economics and social aspect of it mean.
I totally agree with you, because otherwise, I mean, a lot of people have resentment against the HDC, and you put in all this stuff and they'll say it's too far reaching.
So where we, one of the things we'll be doing as a next step, if you read through the last page is, or maybe it's at the top of the first page is once we get through this list, is we'll go through and prioritize them.
Okay.
And we'll also rank their importance. So they're, we'll figure out the way to do that so that it makes sense when we're trying to write the report data, we're trying to work through these elements, these items.
Thanks, Steve.
So that will be one of the things we do. I don't want to keep going back and forth on this, but it's there, the element of the HDC absolutely positively needs this information to make informed decisions. It's a foundational element. Don't you agree?
Yeah, it's like the flood thing.
Yeah, we can't.
We don't understand what somebody's telling us. Yeah, it has to be at 10. And we just go, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I don't disagree.
Yeah. So I mean, it's an important element for us, but one of the ways I think we're going to try and address what we discussed is we're going to try to prioritize these, and we're going to try and take the low-hanging fruit, come up with recommendations, and get that to the HDC so we can try and make some fundamental advancements for things that are non-controversial, that are easy to, like the vent stack pipe, like maybe coming up, the sawtooth. To the extent we can make recommendations early, we will. To the extent we don't have enough information on, say, sacrificial panels, that will be in the priority list, and that we'll deal with that one a little bit later. This one is going to require these number 6 and 7 are going to require input from other individuals. I'm going to vote to prioritize these kind of high, not that we spend a lot of time on them up front, but that we have a discussion And then we get the parameters, we find out who can help us get the information. Because it might take some time to get that information. So we want to put that up on the board, figure out how we want to approach it. Figure out how we can farm out source the information, and then let that take its course as we're working on the other elements. If we wait to the end to address that, it's a foundational element for the HDC, and we waited to the end because we don't want to spend a lot of time discussing it because we want to talk about the architectural elements, which I agree with you on. But then we're going to lag because we don't have the information. So we want to kind of process these two sooner rather than later. I'm not saying first or anything like that.
Well, maybe it's first. I mean, let's not beat around the bush. If we have to attack it and that's gonna make your workflow better for the HDC, then let's get it out of the way.
For me, I mean, just we're kind of venturing off, but I think it's important. We've got enough people here now that we're not going to be repeating ourselves too much. I would suggest that it's important to the HDC that if we do have low hanging fruit, if there is common ground that we find through recommendations on installations, that we advance those. Maybe we'll, in the prioritization stage, this will be a perspective I'll bring up. Is what can we advance? What is going to be relatively easy in discussion and we can advance it. And let's focus on those items first because they can make a fundamental difference now. The next step for me is going to be what, in my mind at least, and I'm open to persuasion, is what are the long-term important, what are the things that are important, but they're going to take longer to develop because we need outside information. For me, that'll be the second level of priority. And I'm open to discussion, but we'll get into that when we get into priority.
I appreciate you building out your perspective because we can't persuade you if we don't know what your approach is.
Yeah, no, and I just haven't gotten into anything like that because I'm only one person, but also I don't want to confuse my having a perspective and you guys thinking that I'm trying to be authoritative on that perspective, because I am being authoritative when I facilitate the meetings on the items.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to segregate my own thoughts as much as possible from this process, because I don't want it to come across as inaccurately and unnecessarily as I'm trying to make it happen a certain way, because that's not what I want to do. The only thing I want to make happen a certain way is get as much information on it that is reasonable, put it together in an organized form so we can actually just have discussion.
All right.
That's my single goal.
Let's do it.
So we're at 4:45.
Yeah, I apologize, that's the time, I have a 5 o'clock I have to get to.
Okay, before we get into this, the next two items are private solar gardens and cluster installations and public solar gardens and cluster installations. What I would suggest is that we would take those up at the next meeting, right after we take up
Our homework.
4, our homework, and that'll give Lucy a chance to read through this. And if there's any questions, just let me know. I'm happy to.
Okay, so the meetings are at.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, guys.
Bye, Tim.
Hi, Tim.
See you next week.
Meetings
Right
are.
on.
Thank you.
Wednesdays at 3:30.
Okay.
And we're gonna do these, I would like to do a once, and I want input on this, but I think it's fair to try and do this once a week until we get the draft done, which hopefully will be the next 2 meetings.
Except for Thanksgiving week, I won't be here.
Yeah,
Wednesday.
Thanksgiving week's never good for anybody.
Well, I'm not saying calendar-wise the next 2, did I say the next 2 Wednesdays or the next 2 meetings?
Aren't the next 2 Wednesdays up to the week before Thanksgiving?
Yeah.
So we have 2 more weeks, 2 more Wednesdays before the Wednesday before Thanksgiving.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Okay, no, I
I'm not
appreciate it.
complaining anything.
Okay, so the idea is that we'll try and get this done in 2 meetings. Review whatever those dates are. We'll review it at the 3rd meeting. It might be that it takes a little bit longer. And then from there, we can decide how frequently we want to meet. But I think it's beneficial for everyone to try and do this every week.
Yeah.
Well, the subject matter is in our heads, and then we'll be, once we, our 3rd or 4th meeting would be to prioritize these.
Sure.
Rank their significance. And then we can establish a meeting schedule, whether it's once every other week, or maybe we want to do, hey guys, before Christmas, we can do 2 more meetings and we might be able to get a couple recommendations out to the HDC before the end of the year. And then we're going to tackle some bigger issues over people are gonna have homework, you know, people are gonna volunteer for things. So just, that's the idea I'm having about meeting. I mentioned so you guys can think about it too. Because it's important that, you know, we're meeting, it's important that people be here at meetings. So if we don't have a similar philosophy on how frequently to meet and you're not here, then it undermines the ability of the group. I'd much rather conform to people's ability to meet and have a cohesive approach to the subject matter than be fragmented.
Oh, I totally agree,
Okay.
but I also agree with Val that Thanksgiving week's out.
And
Yeah.
Christmas, I'm not coming in.
Yeah, and I don't know anyone.
New Year, Valentine's Day.
Right.
I don't know that anyone suggests a meeting on those days. I agree
Is
with you.
there any opportunity to Zoom
Yeah, I think.
After we get, I think after we get
the basics?
the basics done, but we're just having discussion
Yeah,
about topics.
so we haven't had a full group here.
Thank you. We haven't had a full group yet.
So, you know, this is kind of an interesting transition, and sorry for beating a dead horse, but trying to hammer out what the goals are and what the approach is important so that we can all be on the same page and help you to move the ball. Right, so I appreciate you being patient and just, I want to, so we can all stay persistent and kind of get to the root of the approach. I think we're there 100%.
Yeah. Well, we're all getting up to leave. I suppose we should,
Motion to adjourn.
okay.
I have a problem with my knee.
All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Unanimous. Okay, great.
Lucy, we don't get to vote on that.